Okay, so we just have a list of questions kind of about Indie Hall's ethical culture, but also about your personal career, just a few of them, if you're
Sure.
comfortable answering them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But first thing we want to say, like, thank you for meeting with us, of course. I know it's been crazy this past like week or two. So I'm glad that we actually got to talk to you.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting context to be unpacked in the last week that is definitely related to ethics and ethical context for caring for a community like ours. So, not that this is good timing, but it's interesting timing.
Yeah, definitely.
Hang on, let me close my door real quick. There we go. Cool.
Is there anything you want to share with us, like that you think would be interesting for us to know before we ask?
Well, I mean, we can talk more about my background and Indy Hall's background, but maybe just to riff a little bit on sort of what I was just alluding to. Uh, you know, co-working co-working means a lot of different things. I say a lot of times say the word co-working is about as specific as the word restaurant. Which is to say not very specific. Lots of different kinds of restaurants exist under the umbrella of what is a restaurant. But for as long as I've been doing co-working, whether that's casual, taking over a cafe or a bar or somebody's living room, or for the last 13 years running our own space, there's always been an element, to my mind, of stewardship, and the people come first. And a thing I've said a lot of times, I was frustrated with some things yesterday. I said, if people are not your number one priority, they aren't a priority. People can't be number two. It just doesn't work. And so, that was reflected in our business model. It's reflected in our business decisions. It's reflected in our design. And then in the last week, it's been reflected in how we make really hard decisions, like making the clear-headed decision to close the space, and do so both swiftly and to do it swiftly, and to focus on communicating and shift the attention from how do we protect the space to how do we protect the people. And it's been interesting and challenging to watch a lot of my industry, of other shared workspaces, really stretch out staying open into what I would consider an unethically unsafe territory. And yesterday news came out that the WeWork at 19th and Market had their first reported case from a tenant, and I found out about it from a Reddit post, and someone in the Reddit comments was an intern working for a company there who found out about it from that Reddit thread. And so if you think about, WeWork staying open against not just the government imposed guidelines, but also just like the best, the best wishes of their members, putting their employees at risk, putting their members at risk, and also the network effect of that. To then also have a situation where an intern working for a company doesn't find out about it from the staff, the signage, no online communication, for them to find out about it last after they've gone home, had contact with their parents and their grandmother, is like the most crystal clear example of how easy it is to act in the interest of the business unethically, in this very strange set of decisions that we have to make. And so, I've been trying to lead by example to my industry peers. And if there's a silver lining to this, and silver lining is probably not the right way to describe it, but we managed our own crisis about 4 years ago when we found out that we were going to be losing our lease and we had to relocate. And we managed it well, and we made it through. But the difference between then and now is then I tried to lead ethically, but it was just me, my team, and our community who were really being impacted by this problem. And so, I made it a goal to remain transparent in the face of adversity, because that's part of my values. Also hoping that our lessons learned along the way would help other people make decisions when they find themselves in a similar problem. The difference is right now everyone is dealing with this problem at the same time at varying degrees of and on a not just a national but a global scale. And so I think situations like this, like a crisis doesn't change someone's ethics or values. It highlights what they were the whole time. And it's not easy to stay consistent when things are really shitty. But I also think it's the difference between really understanding what your ethics and values are or not.
Yeah, agreed. So, okay, thank you for that. We also have some questions, just more structured, but that was definitely helpful. Obviously, there's a lot happening right now that reflects just like what we're learning.
Totally.
So I'll just start off with the first question. You sort of gave like a little glimpse of it, but how would you describe Indie Hall's ethical culture?
Yeah, so well, if it's okay, I'd like to return the question, and for the context of the study that you're doing, do you have a working definition of ethics? Just so that I know we're talking about the same thing.
We've spoken, if anyone wants to jump in, but we've spoken about it in class a little bit, and there's like no like one definition, but it's because it could be like doing the right thing despite like profits or things like that. It's mostly up to interpretation.
Yeah, okay.
Say anything.
Cool. Anything else from the rest of the crew?
Yeah, we discussed multiple frameworks. So there's the profit maximization framework, there's universalism, there's Kant's empirical categorical method. So, there's just different methods that you would maybe abide by and conduct business.
Cool. Yeah, so let's treat it as a decision-making framework for the sake of this conversation, if that's cool with you. So I think the best answer is that our priority is on I put in two areas, which is collaboration and transparency. Whenever possible, our default is to both work and lead with as much transparency as will not create further risk, and then to come to decisions through discussion. Now, that is not to say that it is a democratic decision-making process. We're a business in addition to a community, and I'm a partner and an owner. I also have a team, a staff who have, I try to offer as much agency to be thoughtful decision makers as well. And because we share a decision-making framework and an ethical decision-making framework, it makes it easier for me to trust them to make calls when I'm not in the room. But the way I think about it is, if a decision needs to be made, it's my job to do the work and my team's job to do the work to understand the viewpoints, the shared viewpoints, the desires, and the concerns, the aspects, sort of like 360 degree, who wants to weigh in on this from the community, to invite people into the process, to share information with them as much so that they can be informed, and then have them reflect back to us. And then we use as much of that as possible to make a decision that we believe is in their collective best interest, which sometimes is tricky because not everyone has the same interest, right? Even with some relative shared values. So, not everyone's going to be happy with every decision, but even when we make a decision that we think might piss people off or make them upset, or worse perhaps, we try to do two things. One is we will sometimes over communicate the reason, this is why we made this decision. And then we will also go so far as to sometimes communicate that we recognize that there are certain people or certain maybe mindsets or situations that will be affected, or that will disagree with the decision. And we want to A, let them know that we know that, and B, let them know that our ears are open and we want to hear, we can collaborate and maybe find a compromise. But first and foremost, I think the worst thing we can do is make people feel like we ignored them. So to say, we heard you, however, here's why we couldn't do that, or here's why we can't do that yet, or here's why we can't do it that way. And that allows me to still move pretty quickly, rather than, either representative democracy or, and I think a lot of people, if you think about like a cooperative, we operate a lot like a cooperative culturally and ethically. But when it comes to a decision-making process, someone's got to make the final decision if a decision's not being made. And that, that rolls back to me in, if and when necessary.
And have you had any like difficult situations with this? Like you sort of touched upon it, like not ignoring them. But...
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of a good example. So yeah, we had a situation a number of years ago where early on, when you became a member of Indie Hall, if you joined with a full-time membership where you get a dedicated desk and it's your own space, you also got a key basically right away. And they weren't digital key cards or anything fancy. It was a metal key to the front door of a building that was full of people's valuable stuff. In hindsight, maybe we were a little overextending in our trust. But for 4 years, while we put a lot of emphasis on the community, and so there was the sense of like, well, people are going to look after it, so it'll be fine. And that worked right up until the moment where it didn't. And we discovered that some things had been stolen, some small electronics. It was nothing, no one cleaned us out, but some weird stuff went missing. And we started talking around, and some folks mentioned, there's this new full-time member who's been here kind of weird hours, and they act kind of weird, and they ask weird questions. And I don't want to say it was them, but we might want to look out into it. And sure enough, we caught them red-handed. They were not only a thief, they weren't very smart. Those two things tend to be kind of correlated. So, the reality of that situation is interesting because, a few $1,000s of things went missing and we got stuff back. But let's say we didn't get stuff back. A couple $1,000s worth of things go missing. That's not the real damage. The real damage in my mind is the trust among everybody else, wondering, well, who's going to be the next person? And I think default response for a business like ours would be to, put in digital key cards, put in cameras, put in background checks. And a lot of co-working spaces do that stuff. They do it before anything bad has happened. But it didn't sit right for me because to me, a lot of that stuff sends a message that is out of line with our ethics and values, in that it sends a message of the default is we don't trust you. When in fact, the default is we do trust you right up until the moment we have a reason not to. So we did two things. One is we called a community town hall, which is one of the first things that we'll often do when we're trying to figure something out. And just like open up the discussion and say, hey gang, problem to solve. Here's what we're thinking. Let's talk about it. This one was a little bit different because we did need to make some fairly decisive choices. And one of them was to not put in cameras and digital key access. Because and to communicate the reason we're doing this is because we don't want to send the message from the jump that all of a sudden people should not be trusted, not just the public, but also amongst each other. And instead, we came up with a security system that we call the Neighborhood Watch security system that we still operate to this day, even though in our new building we're a part of a multi-tenant building that had digital key cards, and we don't have any cameras in our own space, but the rest of the building has cameras. So there's a bit of extra safety precaution there. But we still run the same process to this day, which is in order to get a key and all the things that come with it, you have to wait 30 days instead of on day one, which just kind of makes sense. But then at the end of 30 days, after you join or however long you wait, you get a little worksheet. And the assignment is to go get signatures from 3 other key holding members of the community that say, I got to know this person a little bit. We went to lunch, we had a coffee, we had a conversation. And I think that they're a good human being. That's it. And it's not that I would ever come after a person who signed off on somebody and that person did something. It's that it sends a really clear message of how we operate ethically, that we look after each other, and that the security system is not going to be imposed from the top or from the staff or even from the building and the operations. It's that it's everyone who has a signature, everyone who has a key has a shared responsibility to look after everyone's stuff. So again, sort of borrowing from the neighborhood watch perspective, sending the message through this sort of operation makes it pretty clear to people that we take this really seriously, and it elevates a sense of responsibility where the key is no longer a right or even it is a privilege, but it's a sense of responsibility. And it means that if you're a key holder, that means that you're the extra eyes and ears on the space. And a handful of other co-working spaces around the world have adopted this too, which makes me really proud. But I think it's a good example of how we, in the face of a challenge, make the hard decision to do the not obvious thing and then put in the work to do a thing that actually matches up with our values.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, you actually answered a lot of our questions with your previous answers, so that's really good.
Cool.
But we have a few more questions about, like, I guess, how you feel. I know Indie Hall is like such a community, and it really takes into account like that the people in the area surrounding like creatives and people who are working independently. So especially as an organization like that, do you think it's like your duty or basically every organization's duty to commit resources or time or like volunteer hours to address problems in its larger community, like the city or the town, like of Philadelphia as a whole?
That's a really good question. So I don't. So the short answer is yes, I do. With a caveat that I personally feel ways about telling other people how to do things, and defining other people's ethics and values. I think that there is a fairly clear line of where our sort of shared social responsibility is. But that's my perspective, my worldview, and I know that it's not always shared. So I think with the baseline caveat that people believe that living in a shared society is valuable, then yes, in order to get good things, you have to give good things. You have to care for people other than yourself. Also, I think it's a fundamentally human thing. So I think I am an optimist. I'm a cautious optimist, but I'm an optimist. And I think most people are actually hardwired for this. And in cases where it's not, it's that there's either bad habits or bad incentives. So that caveat out of the way. I think if I think about the context for the question and the Indie Hall's role specifically, I did not create a co-working space in Philadelphia. I created a co-working space for Philadelphia. We exist to make Philadelphia a better place. That is the reason we exist. If we're not doing that, we're not doing our job. Now that takes lots of different shapes and forms, and it changes over time. And it requires regular reflection on, well, what is the Philadelphia that we live in? What does it need? And it's not our job to do everything, and it's not our job to seize every opportunity. But I think it is our job and responsibility to lead by example. And I think your question was, is it necessary to allocate resources to it? And the answer to that is, like, if you don't, then how does it happen? I think some people expect that, my employees, for instance, if I run a traditional company, my employees will use some amount of their time to go out and do volunteer work, where some of them will. But I also think that if that is important to you, then I think it's valuable to say, well, we're going to allocate, some amount of, staff time for that, or whatever it may be. Hang on for just 1 second. One of my teammates is just messaging me. I want to make sure everything's okay. So I think if you want it to happen, expecting it to happen on its own, or even because you said so, isn't enough. You have to make it, you have to carve out time and space for it. Another example of that, I think people expecting things to happen just because they have happened. We implemented a community code of conduct a few years ago. And I'll say to you, for a while, I thought, why do we need this? Like, we're a community whose culture is, we look after each other. People are nice to each other. People look after, we're good. And what it took me a long time to realize is we are, except for in the situations where we're not. And if I have blind spots to where we're not, then there's not an opportunity for me to say, hey, don't do that. And I think you can flip that entire context on its head and go, good things happen that are outside of my field of view. And if they're outside of my field of view, that means they're outside of most people's field of view, and that most people won't know that they can or should do it. So the code of conduct is there for the people who, it's not there for the people who don't need it. It's there for the people who do. And I think the resources towards caring for community and city and things like that, there are people who will do it no matter what you do, but there's plenty that won't. And providing that extra resources and context for it, I think the more you give as a business owner, the more you will see in terms of results. And in a bigger ecosystem perspective, I do believe firmly the more you give, the more you get. But you have to give without expectation of getting. So I think in a business context, yeah, you have to look at it holistically. But yeah, it's super important.
Okay, that makes sense. I'd say somewhat related. Do you think an organization is responsible for their employees' well-being, whether it's at work or outside of work as well?
Are they or should they? Is that the question?
Should they be responsible, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is yes. And I'm going to come at that from the perspective of leadership rather than ownership. If you're the owner of a company, that can mean a whole lot of things, but a company that will last also has leadership, and the owner and the leader are not necessarily always the same person. But if there is, I think if you look at the lens of leadership, who are the leaders of this company? I think in order to be a leader, you do have an ethical responsibility for the people who you lead. That does not mean that you are a martyr. It does not mean that you are solely responsible. I think that's important. I think it's very fragile for all of the responsibility to fall on an individual or, the top end of the spectrum. I think the best answer here is leadership needs to lead by example, but the entire culture of an organization needs to also look after the people, right? It's sort of a shared responsibility. So, I think we live in a time right now where companies don't look after their people in very specific, tactical ways. The healthcare is a big thing here in the U.S. with our stupid broken system. I mean, honestly, everything that coronavirus and work from home now, being quarantined has kind of highlighted is everything that's difficult right now is an example of what shouldn't be, right? And now, businesses are being forced to put their employees' interest first, except for in some cases where they're not, or it's not being enforced. I think this shines a big spotlight on how important it is, because if you don't, in this particular scenario with the virus, you're not only endangering your employees, but you're endangering every single person they come in contact with, and every person that person, like, there's a network effect of your carelessness. So this is just like that problem dialed to 11.
Yeah, I totally agree that it's just putting everything into perspective.
Yeah.
Going off of that, could you talk, if you're comfortable, a little bit about how Indie Hall is handling the whole coronavirus shutdown? I know you said you closed your offices, but is there anything else that you're doing to make sure your members or employees are having a safe and comfortable transition?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could talk for an hour about this, and truthfully, we've been so busy doing it, I haven't really had a time to really think about what we've done. I think everything I said before about like proactive transparent communication has been priority both for my team and the community. But a good example here is, recognizing that my own team, and we have a very small team, it's 2 people besides myself, and they're amazing. I'm super grateful for having them. They're very very good at what they do, and they're handling this shift about as well as anyone could expect to be. But we're also all distracted with the world. Expecting workers to have the same output as usual right now, I think, is unethical. And so, talking to the team and saying, hey, like, take breaks, long ones if you need them. Deadlines don't exist anymore. Just like make progress. We'll work towards goals, but do not beat yourself up, and you absolutely won't make me upset if you're not hitting marks. Now is not the time for that. And we're also talking about adjusting our schedule so everyone can have a day. We've basically been in crisis mode as a team for a week. Everyone's exhausted. So we're working on a schedule for next week where everyone's going to have one full day off in addition to the weekend, and probably 2 half days, just to get our heads back together. The other thing I said is, working from home, none of us have work from home setups because we hate working from home. So we go to a co-working space. And so I told them, I was like, anything you need in order to be comfortable or productive at home, Indie Hall will buy it. So, people buying, a desk, a chair, a lamp, a bookshelf, a fucking movie on iTunes. I don't care. Like, whatever you need to feel comfortable right now, I'm buying it for you. I need them to be as good as they can be, so that when we come out on the other side, we can put things back together. That's good for the business. That's good for the community. It's good for them. That's good for me.
So then, sort of like piggybacking off of that, what would you say is like the main benefit of working independently at Indie Hall as opposed to working independently elsewhere?
So the reality we're living in, where everyone is isolated at home alone, is the reason we exist. And it's funny, like, over the last couple of days, I've gotten messages from people who are like, hey, thank you for the work you've been putting in to move a lot of our community activity online. We already do a ton of stuff online, but now we're looking at, okay, what are all the things that people experience throughout the day, and how do we create an online version of that, even if it's only temporary? Although a lot of it is stuff that we can make available when this is all done, and that makes the Indie Hall community even more accessible to each other from wherever they are. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to the very simple reality that there's a lot of reasons why working from home or even from cafes are not optimal. That's, other distractions, that's any number of things. But the number one reason is that, too much time alone without human contact is not good for creativity. It's not good for productivity. Even if you get good at it, I believe firmly that you're not operating at 100%. So it's not that I think people need to work out of a co-working space all the time, but having a co-working space and having human contact in rotation when even, when the majority of your work is in isolation makes the work that you do in isolation that much better. In addition to that, you get stuck on a problem, who do you ask? Now you've got a community full of people, and the questions can be anything from like a work problem, a technical problem, a business problem, to, I need new tires on my car. Who's got a good tire guy? Those kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, I think those are really the biggest ones. Is keeping. I think there's the sort of mental health, emotional components of having human contact at your fingertips. A lot of people are feeling really isolated right now, and we're even reaching out to past members who are finding themselves at home again and saying, hey, come get active in the online community again. Don't worry about membership right now. We'll sort that out later. But like, don't be alone, especially not now. And I think, we're human beings, are social creatures. We're wired for it. Even if these people are not your closest friends, having other people, some shared momentum, some shared context, helps work get done, even when a crisis isn't going on. And then there's also there's like a pure business component to it as well, which is like, it doesn't take a lot of work for you to become known for being good at a thing or offering a certain service. And then when someone in the community either needs that thing or knows someone who needs that thing, say, oh, I know Gabriella does such and such. Let me connect you and make that happen. So there's like pure business opportunity that comes out of it as well. That is very much you give what you get what you give. You have to make yourself known, visible, and helpful to other people. But especially for like a new independent who's just trying to get their feet, being around people who have a little more experience and can maybe pass along opportunities and help you solve problems that they had to solve in the past, is a massive, massive upgrade.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. I think somewhat related. I think I already know the answer, but I'm wondering if the members at Indie Hall push one another to be better, more ethical workers as well as better professional workers. So they push one another to be better ethically as well as professionally.
I'm sorry. One of my members was just asking something as well. Can you ask that question one more time? I'm really sorry about that.
Yeah, you're good. Do Indie Hall members push one another to be better ethically as well as professionally?
Yeah, I got you. Okay. Yes. Although I would say it's not necessarily an explicit thing. I think that there is a benefit of, like I was just mentioning, if you've got a business challenge, or we can use a business challenge, but it could be anything, and you post a question in one of our skill sharing chat rooms, or you have a conversation in person. I think, just from my own observations, there is a high likelihood that if you get advice and perspective from within our community, it's going to be through the lens of being a good person and doing the right thing. There are lots of other communities that I've been exposed to where the advice you get would be very different because it's all about looking after yourself. So I think that I would have a hard time coming up with an example of someone being explicit about it, but there's a lot of shared lead by example, or in the opportunity to help somebody. I personally have the confidence that if somebody asks for help, and this is just from observing literally thousands of interactions over 14 years, the odds of the advice being ethically sound is extremely high within our community. And I know that that is not always the case outside of our community.
That's great. Yeah, that like answers a lot of our questions. So sort of a wrap up, this is something that we've been talking about a lot in class. Do you think that companies should encourage whistleblowing?
That's a really interesting question. Um, my instinct is yes. At the same time, I'm not sure if companies are the right people to be doing that encouraging. I mean, I don't think it's bad for them to. Maybe I would step back and say, I think leaders, wherever they are, should be encouraging whistleblowing. I think part of the challenge, well, I'll answer the question from the perspective of where I see a challenge. So for instance, again, we have all these wonderful contexts that we're dealing with right now. I know of multiple businesses in Philadelphia that are non-essential, should not be requiring their employees to come in, but they are. And I know that because some of our members who come to me and say, hey, I know about this, what should I do? And the answer here is not super straightforward. A good example is there is so my gut answer is absolutely call 311, report their asses, get them shut down, save lives. That's like, that seems really straightforward. But I also have to consider the fact that for one example, one of the people I talked to, it's not their employer, it's someone who they live with. This person they live with and them already have a complicated, tenuous relationship. If this whistleblowing were to lead to this person being fired or laid off, granted there are legal grounds for that being dealt with, however, it wouldn't make things any less complicated. And it potentially puts that person in danger at home who they're now quarantined with. So how do you handle that? I don't know. That's a weird one. I'm still like literally dealing with that right now.
Yeah, that's one.
Where I think it's a really good example of where things are not cut and dry. And I'm sure that when I asked earlier, what's the definition of ethics, and you named some frameworks. There's more than one right answer here. And the way I think about it when things are hard, option A sucks and option B sucks. Is there a hidden option C? For example, right now, it would be potentially unethical for me to be the whistleblower here, because it would not be hard for it to be traced back to the relationship I have with this person, and then it to be clear that this person was the one who tipped me off. However, if I go to, one of our local tech news outlets, for instance, technically Philly being one of them, and say, hey, I know about one or more companies who should be sending their employees home. We're not requiring them to come in, and they're not. This can't get back to me. What can you do? I feel like a good journalist is a great tool in these ethically murky, challenging questions, when ethically knowledge being shared is important, but when there are secondary side effects, I think a good journalist, sadly not all journalists, but a good journalist is trained to think about those secondary effects, and know about what tools and precautions can be put into place. I don't know what they are. This is like new worlds for me to be figuring out, but that's the closest thing I've got to a hidden option C for this particular ethical quandary.
Yeah, that was definitely a tough one. Thank you. That was pretty much all of our questions. If you want to add anything else, or...
No, you asked great questions. So thank you for that. I'm not sure if you noticed, I did leave this session recording. So if you like, I can send you the video afterwards, just so you've got this for future reference. In case there's anything you missed in the notes.
Cool.
When things get back to whatever normal we're allowed to get back to at some point, I would love to have the four of you come down and still visit and see what we look like when we're not stuck on our screens. But this is cool. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I know it's very limited, so thank you again.
This was a nice reprieve. It was a nice excuse to step away from everything else for a few minutes, so I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right,
thank you, Alex.
Be safe out there, everybody.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.